The void is never truly silent. Even in the deepest reaches of the galaxy, where starlight fades into a thin, cold shimmer and the maps of the Imperium dissolve into uncertain myth, there is always a hum, faint, distant, eternal. It is the low, resonant vibration of ancient engines older than living memory, the soft crackle of radiation brushing across adamantine hulls, the whisper of eons brushing past like a slow cosmic tide. Space is empty, yes, but it is an emptiness that listens. Tonight, within that boundless dark, a single warship drifts with the grace of a cathedral carried on ghostly winds. Its hull is black as mourning cloth, etched with the scars of centuries-long crusades. Gilded reliefs of sword-bearing angels line its armored spine, and banners hang like frozen shadows, each one painted with the cross of the eternal crusade. This is a vessel of the Black Templars, a fortress of faith, a sanctuary of unending war. Inside, the air is still and cold, the temperature maintained at a degree that would chill ordinary men to the bone. But the warriors who dwell here are no longer bound by such frailties. To them, the cold is familiar, almost comforting, a reminder of duty, of discipline, of the zeal that keeps their purpose burning brighter than blood or breath. The corridors stretch like the interior of a Titan-sized cathedral, tall archways upheld by ribbed steel, alcoves shaped like monks' chapels, each shadowed corner adorned with candles whose wax has long since hardened into thin white tears. The faint scent of incense lingers here as well, stubborn, smoky, clinging to the metal the way memory clings to bone. Through these corridors, quiet hymns drift like drifting echoes of distant choirs. They seep from vox speakers set high into the walls, their voices soft, reverent, almost tender. In his light, the darkness breaks. In his name, the wicked fall. In his service, we are steel. The hymns are not loud. They are barely audible, like a lullaby sung through glass. A comfort to some, a warning to others. Servitors shuffle along the halls with clumsy, mechanical grace. Their limbs whir softly, the servos whining as they carry relics, mend damaged plating, or adjust the lingering shadows of flickering lumen globes. They do not speak, only breathe shallowly, their chests rising and falling like forgotten remnants of humanity trapped within machines. Their presence is part of the ship's rhythm, like the pulse of an organism. And somewhere deeper within the vessel, beneath layers of ceramite and sacred scripture, the voice of the machine spirit murmurs in low transmissions. A slow, steady hiss of distant vox static flickers through the vents, like a whisper that never fully forms words. It is peaceful in its own way, a strange, somber peace that hangs like mist over a graveyard. In the heart of this floating cathedral lies the Reclusium, a vast chamber where statues of long-dead heroes stand in silent witness. Their stone faces stare outward, their expressions stern and eternal. The light here is dim but warm, filtered through stained glass depictions of holy crusades that never fade, no matter how many battles the ship endures. Beneath one mosaic, an image of the Emperor as a radiant figure casting down a horned monster, kneels a warrior clad in obsidian armor. He does not move at first. Not even the rise of a breath breaks his stillness. He kneels the way a mountain kneels, solid, unmoving, timeless. This is Brother Templar Aurelian, a warrior shaped by centuries, carved by devotion, chiseled by fire and faith. His armor bears the marks of 100 battles, deep slashes filled with melted gold, purity seals layered so densely that they flutter like a monk's tattered robe. His gauntlets are clasped tightly around the hilt of a massive chainsword, its teeth silent now, but still stained with the memory of flesh and armor. Aurelian keeps his head bowed. The Reclusium is quiet around him, save for the gentle murmur of chanting audio scrolls and the clicking of old candle flames. Shadows stretch long behind him, stretching across the polished stone floor like the trailing cloak of a forgotten king. To look at him is to see devotion made manifest. To hear him is another story. For beneath the armor, beneath the immaculate discipline and the unyielding faith, something stirs, something small, something quiet. a feeling he is not meant to have. Aurelian breathes slowly, the soft hiss of his armor's internal filters releasing faint plumes of cold air. Each breath echoes in his helm, filling the space between his ears with a rhythmic metallic beat, steady, precise, almost like the ticking of an unseen clock. And yet, each breath feels heavier than the last. He lifts his gaze to the mosaic above him. The Emperor's radiant image shines down with unbroken serenity. Aurelian has knelt beneath this image many times, always feeling a surge of purpose, of purity, of clarity. Tonight, however, he feels something else. Not doubt, not fear, something quieter, something subtler. A flicker, a faint tremor at the edge of his thoughts, like a breeze stirring the edges of a sealed scroll. Aurelian frowns, though the expression is hidden beneath his helmet. He presses a gauntleted hand to his chest, where the black carapace melds beneath skin and bone. The sensation is strange, almost like a second heartbeat. Thump, 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 just slightly out of sync with his own. He tells himself this is nothing, a trick of nerves, a symptom of prolonged meditation, a misaligned power feed within the armor, but the sensation remains, steady, persistent, growing. Around him, the ship groans softly as if turning in its sleep. The hull creaks with ancient pressure, the sound traveling down the columns of the reclusiam like a whispered warning. For a moment the hymns trailing from the Vox speakers falter, just a hiccup, a dip in clarity before resuming. Aurelian lifts his head. The air feels colder. The shadows feel longer. The silence feels too heavy, but he does not stand. He cannot. Duty roots him to the floor as surely as chains would. He is a Black Templar, a sword of the eternal crusade, chosen not to doubt, not to question, but to believe with every shred of flesh and steel that binds his form. His faith is strong, unshakable, and yet there is a tension coiled deep behind his ribs like a whisper that wants to be heard. He lowers his head again and begins to pray. The words are ancient, familiar, repeated countless times since his initiation into the chapter. In his name I am reforged. In his light I am unbroken. In his service I am endless. His voice is a low vibration that hums through his helm and into his bones. Each line is steady, perfect, devout, but as he speaks he becomes aware of another sound barely perceptible, so faint that a mortal ear would never detect it. A second voice, muttering beneath his own, a soft, static-laced echo. In his name, aim, Aurelian's breath catches, the words falter, the echo fades, silence. He remains frozen, listening, his superhuman senses sharpened like blades. Nothing, just the distant whir of servitors, the quiet hum of lumen globes, the soft tap of melted wax falling to the floor. He exhales slowly. The tension ebbs from his shoulders. It must have been Vox bleed over, a stray transmission brushing across the internal channels. That is all. And yet, the sense of wrongness lingers like a shadow pressed against the back of his mind. After long minutes of stillness, Aurelian finally rises. His armor shifts with a heavy, ceremonial groan, the plates gliding against one another with unbroken precision. As he stands, several purity seals flutter against his greaves, their parchment edges brushed by a cold draft. He turns toward the main corridor. His footsteps echo like thunder across the chamber. One step, then another, each one steady and deliberate. His shadow stretches before him, cast long by the flickering candlelight. It moves with him, yet for a moment, just a fraction of a heartbeat, it seems to lag behind, as if the light hesitated, as if the shadow were reluctant. Aurelian pauses, looks back. Nothing. The chamber remains still. The candles sway gently beneath unseen drafts. The stained glass flickers in the dim luminance. He continues. As he walks through the corridor, the ship's atmosphere seems to shift around him. The hymns grow more distant, the Vox static sharper. Servitors turn their heads as he passes, just slightly, their blank eyes following him before their mechanical minds pull them back to their functions. More than once, Aurelian feels the faint prickling sensation of being observed. Not by cameras, not by chaplains, not by men, by something else. Something ancient, patient, quiet. something that listens from the dark corners where the lumen globes flicker. He tells himself this is imagination, that a warrior of his centuries cannot be unsettled by shadows or machine whispers. But the second heartbeat continues, quiet, steady, relentless, and with it something else, a memory not his own, a flash of battle he never fought, a scream in a voice he doesn't recognize, gone as quickly as it appeared. Aurelian stops again. His gauntlet tightens around his chainsword's hilt. His faith remains strong, his resolve unbroken, his purpose eternal. But something inside him feels off, something small, something quiet, something that has only just begun to wake. The Black Templars swear themselves to a crusade that is older than the men who lead it, older than the ships that carry it, older than the memory of the worlds they have burned and the saints they have canonized. Their oaths are carved into bone and brass, etched on purity seals, whispered into the hollows of helmets before the first pull of a respirator's breath. They are vows that do not allow for hesitation. They do not permit reflection. They take the soul, fold it, and press it flat until only one thing remains: purpose. To stand with a Black Templar is to bear a history that is heavier than any war gear. It is to carry an inheritance of ritual and punishment that polishes the edges of human feeling down to a blade-sharp zeal. Their devotion is a liturgy made of steel and flame, and every step they take echoes with the sound of ordinances read aloud in the vaulted chambers of the reclusiam. The oaths they recite are not simply words. They are the scaffolding upon which identity is rebuilt and then remade again, until what remains is faith enacted by muscle, by ceramic, by the slow, grinding machinery of duty. In the soft half-light of their chapels, the Templars create rites to keep themselves whole. Each new recruit is anointed in oil that smells faintly of ozone and old incense. Their armor is blessed with litanies whispered by chaplains whose faces have the serenity of those who see nothing but the will of the Emperor. Chains are wrapped and prayers are tied around wrists. The rituals tighten like a corset over the living flesh of a boy who will, in time, become less a man than a sigil. Rituals are precise as synapses. They are performed with the same mechanical grace as a servitor's gears. A Black Templar will cross himself 100 times before a battle, run his gauntlet along the edge of a relic until both are warmed by friction, kiss a banner as though it were the brow of a lover. They will etch the names of the fallen onto bone tablets, then hammer those tablets into the hull as though to graft memory into metal. Everything is made permanent: the vows, the scars, the hunger for the next crusade. Permanence is how they survive the endlessness of their wars, and yet permanence demands sacrifice. Humanity leaks away under the weight of eternal devotion. It is not a single moment when a man is lost. It is a slow reclamation, an attrition of small things. The Black Templars trade smiles for solemn nods, laughter for the measured cadence of liturgical cadences. Where once a brother might have hesitated to raise a blade, now he raises it without a second thought, because to hesitate would be to betray the oath. The sacrifice is not always violent in visible ways. It most often appears in the tiny absences: abandoned letters never sent to wives, children's faces that remain an ache behind clenched teeth, the dwindling spark of curiosity at the sight of a star system's unique bloom. The first layer to peel away is softness. Sentiment is expensive, and in a chapter that prizes purity of purpose, it is the first casualty. Brothers begin to sleep less, rest less, until the warm bed of memory becomes a cold slab of stone and the only dream allowed is one of victory. They speak in shorter sentences, their voices rounded off at the edges. Emotions that might have been voiced in private are instead filed away in reliquaries, folded, labeled, sealed. A Black Templar learns how to carry grief as one carries a relic, upright, contained, and never to be displayed for personal pity. The transformation is physical as much as it is spiritual. Ceramite is the external sign of the internal change. Plates that fit like second skin, black as midnight, catching candlelight and making men into icons. But armor does more than protect. It cocoons a man's movement and his thought, encloses him in rituals, in doctrine, in unquestioning combat roles. Where once a man's fingers might have brushed an infant's hair, they now trace the edges of a purity seal with the same tenderness, as if to imprint the warmth of human contact onto parchment. The seals crack over years. Cracked purity seals are badges of survival, of battles weathered, yet they are also maps of things left behind. Each fissure is a fracture in memory, a father who never told a child he loved them, a brother who never asked for forgiveness, a lover whose voice became part of an old song. Icons hang everywhere in a Black Templars world, metal faces of saints with chipped halos, skulls polished until they shine, enameled crosses that catch light like promises. But in dim passageways, these icons begin to mutter. The soft flicker of blackened candles makes their shadows grow long and strange, and paint seems to warp where the light cannot reach. A soldier might stand before an icon and swear that it looks back, not with the blank serenity of a statue, but with a gaze that measures and judges. The illumination reveals everything it is meant to hide. The hollowness at the center of a vow. The loss of identity is a quiet theft. Men swap their names for honorifics, their birthright for a lineage made of deeds and banners. They speak of the chapter as if it were a farmstead that raised them, the only home that matters. Personal histories are pruned. The boy who once loved the ocean becomes Brother Sea no longer. He is Brother Templar, the title sewn over the memory like a brand. Their faces, when visible between the helm and the cephal plate, grow older in a way that does not reflect years but rather erosion. The eyes become flat pools, reflective surfaces that catch the light and reveal nothing of the man beneath. Inside this new skin, memories are like candles guttering in the wind. Each recollection that slips from reach feels like a wick eaten by flame. The flicker that remains is small and tenuous. A brother may remember a lullaby, but only the phrasings and not the voice. He may remember the palette of a childhood sky, but cannot summon the month when it occurred. The forgetting is not merely failure. It is permitted and encouraged. A mind with fewer attachments is a mind easier to devote wholly to purpose. Yet the human residue never fully departs. It persists in the oddest places. An involuntary flinch at a child's cry, the sudden halt of a ritual when the memory of a mother's scolding surfaces, a dream of warm sunlight that dissolves into the hiss of a power feed when the alarm sounds. These fragments are dangerous. They are smuggled contraband in the fortress of devotion. They invite introspection, and introspection invites doubt. This is the internal struggle that defines the Black Templars in hours when thunder does not hammer on the hull and when the candles have burned low. There is a constant struggle between the prescribed silence of faith and the murmuring undercurrent of memory. A brother who has spent decades under the hammer of ritual will find that, in the private vaults of his mind, images surface unbidden. The curve of a child's cheek, the smell of sea salt on a father's clothes, an old laugh that was once contagious. These images are quicksilver, hard to hold and easier to dismiss. Each dismissal is another notch on the same eroding plank of being. The manner in which these memories flicker is almost ceremonial. They open like the flame of a candle. First the smell, then the tongue of light, then a shape coalescing in the dark. Voices slip back into consciousness like stolen broadcasts. A mother saying, "Wait," a friend saying, "Stay with me," a lover saying, "Remember me." The words do not carry the grammar of the present. They are underlaid with a distance, as though heard through thick glass. The blackness of their armor creates a paradox. It is both shield and prison. It protects the man from external harm, but also seals him from internal succor. Voices the Templars can no longer place begin to thread through those stolen fragments. The chaplains speak of sacred texts and holy sanctions. Apothecaries speak in the clipped technicality of wound care. The serfs murmur of mundane concerns. But there are other voices, older, more persistent, that lurk just beyond ritual. Sometimes they are the remnants of battlefield shouts, the names of comrades chanted like doomed litany. Other times they are the soft murmurings of doubt, the small internal objections that begin with a single disobedient thought. What if? Those questions are weeds in consecrated soil. They are small, but they grow fast once planted. The ritual system recognizes their danger and binds the mind with counters. Renewed oaths, longer vigils, penances designed to burn the questions into ash. A brother may spend a night walking the deck in silence, reciting the same prayer thousands of times until the syllables scrape raw and the voice is only a rasp. He may submit to self-flagellation in ritual chambers, letting the pain drown out the memory of a mother's face. Each act of discipline is both a denial and a reinforcement, an insistence that the self is lesser than the cause. Symbols become tools and weapons. A purity seal, once an emblem of protection and remembrance, begins to function as a barrier against introspection. To touch it is to touch a promise that the world is ordered and purposeful, but the seals that grow old and cracked are telling. Cracks spider across parchment like the fissures in an aging painting. They mark battles survived and rituals repeated too many times. They mark the slow seep of human frailty through the seams of stoic devotion. Blackened candles drip slow tears of wax that curl into fungus-like swirls. Their smoke perfumes the air with the scent of burnt offerings. Icons, when seen in the dim, do not merely depict virtue. They contort into parables that ask questions the liturgy cannot answer. Under low light, halos seem too thin, smiles too tight, eyes too knowing. A reliquary may glow faintly in the dark, an illegal private warmth. And the armor, oh, the armor speaks its own language. It is not inert. In the slow quiet, the servo motors in the joints whisper. The ceramite flexes. The seals in the network ping like distant insects. These small mechanical noises become the metronomes of a brother's nights. Sometimes a plate will chafe at the seam of skin and send a sharp sting up a bone. And for one absurd moment, the man remembers what pain felt like before it was ritualized. It is a dangerous reminder. Armor is meant to be conformity made manifest. The plates align, the joints lock, the gate becomes a doctrine. But sometimes the armor seems to be alive, responding in sympathy to the mind it encases. A gauntlet will tighten as if by itself when the wearer's heartbeat quickens. A pauldron servo will click in rhythm with a memory. This reciprocity is a source of comfort for some, terror for others. For Aurelian, our silent heart in the last chapter, these manifestations have begun to thrum with a frequency he cannot ignore. He senses the paradox of being both shielded and assaulted by the same thing. He is a man who prays with his hands on a hilt that remembers the warmth of blood. A man who kneels beneath mosaics whose tesserae hide tiny chips of bone. His past drips through the seams of his devotion like water through neglected mortar. Sometimes he tastes sweet fruit, anachronistic and obscene in the metallic chapels, only to realize it is the dream of a child's apple that has invaded his palate. The internal struggle is not always melodramatic. Often it is microcosmic, a hesitation before striking a foe whose face in the dimness resembles a father, a softening at the sound of a hymn that carries an old melody sung by a nun he once knew, a reluctance to break a relic that fits in his hand the way a hand fits into a glove. Each hesitation accumulates, like rust accumulating on a blade. No single fleck of rust matters, but over years, a sword becomes more brittle than it was forged to be. And still, the Templars endure. They persevere because ritual is not solely oppression. Ritual is also a kind of nourishment. In the liturgy, in the repetition, men find grounding. They trade breadth of feeling for depth of focus. They find purpose in the calluses of their hearts. The chapter provides them with rites that teach how to forget and how to remember only what must be remembered. In the crucible of these disciplines, identity is remade along the pattern of the chapter's mythos. A man becomes an archetype, a function in an economy of war. This reconfiguration is not merely loss, it is also adaptation. It is how these men survive where ordinary men would shatter. But adaptation comes with a cost, the loss of empathy, the narrowing of vision until the world is only battleground and banner and the face of the enemy. Those left without the capacity to mourn are efficient in ways that are as monstrous as they are admirable. They can stand on a smoking field and place their hands on the bellies of the dying, recite litanies and return, as if nothing had happened. The absence of a tear becomes a strange badge of honor. Symbols, the cracked seals, the blackened candles, the drooping halos, exist to remind the Templars of both their sanctity and their fragility. They are talismans that bind together a society on the brink of losing itself. By giving ritual teeth and rules, the chapter keeps the contagion of doubt at bay. Yet these very objects are also the mirrors in which the loss of self becomes visible. A cracked purity seal looks back and sees not the vow but the human hand that first affixed it. A blackened candle remembers the warmth of a mother's hearth. An icon in low light might not just judge, it might mock. A final irony: the more thoroughly a Black Templar sacrifices himself to the cause, the more he becomes indispensable to that cause. In that indispensability, he becomes less free and more useful, an instrument whose usefulness masks the hollowness that made him so efficient. The chapter needs him to be what he is. He needs the chapter to justify what he has given. It is a reciprocal hunger that devours both parties in time. At the heart of this exchange is the persistent human question that refuses to be ritually excised. At what point does devotion become erasure? The Black Templars answer in their way by continuing the march. They take the field, they light the black candles, they press cracked seals into their armor, and they recite the oaths again. In the night they may dream of children or bread or seas they cannot name, and in the morning they will polish their relics until they shine like small suns. The cycle continues. And yet, within that cycle, small fissures appear. A brother may hesitate, or a chaplain may notice his hand trembling while he signs a benediction. These are the things that worry the keepers of orthodoxy. They mark the beginning of a fracture that liturgy alone cannot correct. For even the most devout among them can be undone by a single memory that returns fully formed and refuses to be extinguished. The Black Templars will call it a trial, a penance meant to burn impurities away. They will double their prayers and tighten their vows. But there are times, rare and terrible, when ritual fails to smother what flickers beneath the armor. When a memory refuses to be sealed, it becomes contagious. It passes in looks exchanged in the mess halls, in a hushed aside between brothers, in the odd silence that falls over a battalion before it charges. At those moments, the fortress of faith shows a seam, and through the seam something of the old humanity slips back in. Not wholesale, not entirely, but as a shard. A memory of laughter, a memory of warmth, that begins to reconfigure devotion into something that is recognizably human. Whether that shard is salvation or poison is a question for later chapters. For now, the Black Templars carry on, their candles burning black and steady, their purity seals cracked but serviceable, their icons bent to their light. They march into the night with hymn and blade, with oath and hunger, and with the knowledge that their sacrifices are both sacred and terrible beyond measure. And somewhere, under layers of ritual and steel, a small, forbidden ember, human in its stubbornness, waits to see if it will become a flame. The ship's hull never quite forgave the years. Even when it moved with practiced indifference through the black, its skin bore ridges and scars like the hands of an old man. The metal remembered impacts and repairs, the quiet class of 1,000 small reconciliations. At certain hours, when the ship turned through a dark current or the last of a reactor bank cycled off for maintenance, the whole hull would sigh, a long, low sound that rolled down corridors and through ventilation tunnels like distant thunder. That sighing had a way of making men think of lungs and of breathing and of what it meant to be alive. It was during one such sigh that Aurelian first noticed the change. He was on routine watch, an old habit he kept even when duty did not demand it, walking the length of the foredeck with his chainsword slung at his hip. The deck was slick from the condensation that sometimes formed when cold space met internal heat. Lumen globes hummed with the same low tone as the ship's bones, and their light pooled on ceremonial banners, on racks of weapons, on the blackened wax of a row of candles left to gutter like a line of small dying stars. Somewhere aft, a servitor dragged a crate along the corridor with a clumsy, mechanical rhythm. The servitor's limbs moved with practiced, indifferent accuracy, its head tilted as its optic array tracked Aurelian and registered his presence. There was nothing unusual about servitors. They were the sutures of the ship, the mechanical muscle that kept old wounds from opening. Still, when a servitor's fingers brushed the edge of a purity seal on a crate, and the seal cracked with a sound like an old whiplash, it felt to Aurelian like something had been scratched into air. He paused. The servitor's optic flicked, and for a moment the machine's head was misaligned. A static blistered across its comms matrix. A faint whisper of noise crawled up the servitor's vocal feed, like a dead man trying to remember a prayer. The servitor tilted its head, as though listening, not to the hymn playing down the corridor, but to an empty space where only the ship's hum should be. Aurelian tightened his grip on the hilt of his chainsword. The metal under his glove vibrated with the echo of that little noise. He told himself it was nothing, servitor's glitch. Circuits wore thin, wire insulation came loose, ancient firmware hiccuped. A man of his rank did not let superstition grow. Faith was not the same as fear, yet he could not help the way his shoulders bristled. The corridor felt narrower than it had a heartbeat ago, as if the walls themselves had leaned inward with curiosity. He continued his patrol. The early hours on a Black Templar vessel had the smell of old worship. Incense burned too long, the tang of welted leather, the faint metallic perfume of runoff from alloy polish. But underneath those familiar scents there was now something else, something sweeter and fouler at once. The iron knot of blood smell of hydraulic fluid, overtaken by a thinner, tarnished stench that might have been oil, might have been wax, might have been something else. Someone had left a reliquary open in a maintenance alcove ahead. The token inside, an old charm carved from bone and wrapped in linen, was leaking a dark, syrupy fluid from a hairline fissure in its case. He knelt. The fluid coated the lint of his gauntlet with a sheen that caught the lumen light. Under the lamplight it looked almost like oil. But when he pressed his thumb to it and raised his hand, the scent that rose was not engine oil. It was warm and metallic and very nearly the smell of healed flesh. Aurelian blinked. He tasted something in the back of his throat, an echo of salt and copper, and for a moment the world tilted. He set his thumb to his lips, but the taste was already gone. He secured the reliquary and sealed it again with a fresh parchment scroll. The purity seal he affixed was new, uncracked. His gauntlet stamped the sigil down so hard the wax left a faint print on his palm. Official procedure. Clean, certain, a small loop tied tight. Still, the leak lingered in his mind like a bruise. That night the hymn feed spat briefly and then steadied. Vox channels carried the voices of far-off chaplains in static-skimmed tones, reminding men to keep the vigil. Men murmured responses. The ship's communal feed delivered the usual assortment of sermons, battle histories, and a litany of names for the dead. They were orderly, ritualized, comforting in their repetition. Aurelian listened as he walked, repeating the words within his head as though reciting an incantation could anchor away the oddness. The small things multiplied. A maintenance console in Armory Sector 3 blinked with a line of unread diagnostic logs, each entry tagged by time and signed by technicians long dead. The logs showed nothing unusual: power surges within acceptable ranges, valve cycles nominal. Yet each log contained an appended message in a voice print that the technicians did not use. The message was only a string of static and then a single, repeated phrase buried beneath miles of noise. They are still waiting. The message had no signatory, no timestamp beyond the loop of recording, yet the voice print matched no known pattern. Aurelian replayed it once, then twice. The words did not belong. It was as if someone had exhumed a language and left only the bones. He shut the console down and walked away. The corridor swallowed the sound of his boots. Dreams spoke next. They came in threshed negligence in the small hours when the ship's vigilaries were counting breaths. They were not full visions at first, only the edges of images, smells, tastes, a flicker of color. Aurelian would sleep for a tired hour and wake with the taste of salt on his tongue, and the spine of his hands prickling as though from the touch of sea wind. Once he woke after a brief slumber to find a child's lullaby hummed under his breath. He had not known he remembered it. The cadence was wrong, pitched lower than any child's voice, and yet he hummed it out of instinct. The dreams tightened into scenes. He saw, in a dream, a cathedral that was not the Reclusium, taller, ancient beyond the age of any chapter, and within it a sea of black candles, thousands of them, their flames doped with some dark oil that made their light pulse sickly. At the center of that cathedral stood an altar. On the altar lay a helmet, gleaming and black, and inside the helmet was a small hand, an infant's hand curled like a claw. When he reached out, the hand uncurled, and he heard a voice whisper from beneath layers of cloth and memory, "Come home." He woke with his gauntlet open and wet. On deck, a squad of veterans downed their ration gel in silence. Their eyes were a little too bright. They watched him the way men watch an animal that remembers a place it had once called home. One of them, Brother Matthias, whose purity seals were nearly as old as the platoon, laughed suddenly, a sound that startled even the servitors. It was a dry, brittle noise, and it cut off mid-syllable as if someone had offended the ritual by making too much noise. "Did you sleep?" Aurelian asked him. Matthias did not answer. He only reached into his breastplate, pulled out a small icon, a thimble-sized reliquary, and popped its cap. The icon exhaled a thin wisp of smoke that smelled faintly of roses and rust. Matthias closed his eyes, and for a moment his face was unmasked. There was something startled there, like the look of a man who has glimpsed something he is not supposed to see. "You saw it too," Matthias whispered when he opened his eyes. Aurelian said nothing. He had not yet decided whether the thing Matthias meant was a prayer or a warning. The ship's sermon feed spoke of ritual rigor. Chaplains ordered longer nights of penance. Men were told to increase their rounds. Consolations were offered by those whose routines were unchanged by strange dreams. Yet the script's confident voice undercut itself more than once with an edge of worry. Passages were read slower. Names lingered a fraction longer. One segment on the sanctity of relics closed with an awkward silence, and then the feed dropped unexpectedly, as if a cog had slipped from the speaker's wheel. That drop and absence left a ringing space in his ears. In that ring, noises lived. Acts of pipes and the tiny ratcheting breath of the black carapace, the distant click of a maintenance clamp slipping from a servitor's hand, the soft scuff of a boot on an oily patch of deck. Each noise seemed to carry more meaning than it ought. They were like the small, overlooked stitches at the base of a tapestry that, when loose, threatened the whole weave. A relic that had been safe for centuries bled oil that smelled like iron and old prayers. A purity seal crumbled on an officer's breastplate as he leaned against a bulkhead. The broken parchment unfurled, and underneath his skin, impossibly and without explanation, was the faint trace of another name carved small and intricate into the metal beneath the wax. The name was not his. Aurelian read it and felt the same reflexive chill that comes when an old friend calls you by a name you no longer own. "Names get recycled," one of the tech priests said dismissively when Aurelian showed him. "Plaques get misfiled. Thermo-expansion can stress things." He said it with a practiced patience, a litigator's calm. Yet his hands jittered as he spoke, and when he applied the new seal it cracked like old bread. Even the ship's machines began to sing with oddness. Generators would cough a baritone moan that resolved into a cadence resembling words. The organ tone of the reactor hummed a chord that seemed almost, for a fraction, to mimic the cadence of an old Templar chant. Servos in the metallic frame of the black carapace began to click in a pattern that his mind matched subconsciously to the rhythm of his heartbeat. The armor that had once been impersonal began to register internal abnormalities. temperature spikes that could not be traced to a feed, a faint, rhythmic pulsing beneath the ribs that synchronized with a memory he could not own. When he visited the reliquary vault 2 days into the strange occurrences, the attendant, a pale acolyte with ink still smudged on his fingers, was absent-mindedly turning a medallion between his fingers. It was an innocuous trinket, carved bone, a ring of iron, the sigil of a saint. Yet the medallion hummed faintly in the acolyte's hand. He placed it down, and the hum traveled along the row of reliquaries, a soft, imperceptible vibration that made the hair on Aurelian's neck stand up. Inside the largest reliquary, wrapped in ceremonial linen, a relic pulsed. Not like a beating heart. Its rhythm was slower, deeper. It was as though something had been lulled to sleep within the armor of the thing, and now it shifted in its dreams. When Aurelian drew close, he could not tell whether the noise came from the relic or from his chest. A subordinate touched the cushion on which the relic lay and recoiled, dropping his hand. His fingers left a smear of something dark and oily on the linen. The chaplain who came to see the relic performed the blessing ritual twice, and then 3 times, his lips moving faster each time until prayers began to unravel into the shape of panic. He set a fresh seal on the box and smeared holy chrism until the wax blend made a mess of the seal itself. That night, the symbol on the seal, normally bold and uncomplicated, seemed to slither like a living thing in the corner of Aurelian's eye. Small, private discoveries multiplied into a chorus. A line of bruises appeared on the back of a serf who had been found asleep in the chapel, his muscles rigid as if holding against an invisible weight. A chaplain's log recorded a midnight exorcism that read more like an argument. A field bishop's portrait had been slashed and repaired with a hand so unsteady the brush strokes bled. The portrait's eyes, when seen at angle, seemed to follow one like a living thing. And always, beneath the liturgy, beneath the ship's steady heartbeat, there was the whisper. It came in a dozen minor ways. A static-laced phrase played backwards on a feed. A patch of shadow that pooled too blackly beneath a pylon. A servitor's chirp distorted into 2 separate tones that overlapped like a shallow echo. It never spoke out loud, never once formed a clear, complete sentence in Aurelian's hearing. It suggested. It offered half impressions and left him to glue them together. He would be polishing a shield and catch on a whisper that seemed to say, "Feed us," and he cut his hand on the rim of the shield in the motion as if that small cut had been predetermined. Night after night, the whisper braided itself into other things. It entered dreams and replaced faces in them with wrongness. It braided into hymns and made certain words roll in a manner that scraped at the back of the throat. It insinuated itself into rituals, making prayers last just a beat too long. In that beat, meanings shifted. Other men began to notice. They began to move with the furtiveness of those aware of being watched in a place where no eyes should be. Brotherhood meetings ended earlier. Chaplains organized extra vigils. A small group of Brother Templars, men who had known each other since initiation and whose purity seals were so old they creaked, took to meeting in the storerooms at odd hours with the lids of crates chapped aside as if for offerings. They would sit on crates and speak in tones fit for a confessional, and when Aurelian walked by he could overhear fragments. Not the same as last crusade. The oil it tastes like memory. If it speaks, do we answer? Once, near the oxygen scrubbers, a pair of veterans argued until the argument turned to silence. One of them, Sir Jorik, a man with an old scar that ran like a river from shoulder to thigh, pressed a palm against his helmet and said something so quiet it might have been only a prayer. It remembers flesh. What exactly it referred to, none could say aloud. The group's unspoken consensus was that naming whatever prowled the ship gave it weight. They were devout, but superstition is a form of faith too, and they indulged it with the same solemnity as they did doctrine. And then the ship spoke in a voice that, for the first time, spoke as though it were awake. It was not a voice with words. It was a modulation, a deep mechanical susurrus that rolled through the hull and through ribs and into bone. The crew felt it as a pressure, as a softness in the air, like a breeze that tasted like oil and old blood. Aurelian stood in the gallery beneath the great mosaic of the emperor and listened. The image above him, golden, immovable, felt suddenly like a false canopy. The hum coalesced into a cadence that matched an old lullaby he did not think he remembered. Around him, men crossed themselves in tightened grasp on weapons. Wireless chatter spat alarms, and then closed as guilds of tech priests scrambled to patch and trace. The cadence ended with a silence so complete that the ship's skin seemed to hold its breath. In that silence, Aurelian heard what might have been the faintest of words, like a child rehearsing a phrase. "Come home." He did not know to whom it addressed him, whether the call was for him alone or for the ship itself. He felt rather than heard the same tug he had felt at the reliquary, a small, impossible pull towards some place old and waiting. The sensation felt like hunger. It felt like loss. For the first time since his initiation, there was a question that would not be stamped out by ritual. What if the thing they worshipped, what if the things they kept safe behind seals and candles, were not only objects for veneration, but vessels for something else? What if devotion did not merely sanctify an object, but invited something in? He returned to his chamber that night and stared at a purity seal on his breastplate until the wax shimmered and distorted in the low light. The seal's fissures looked suddenly like fissures in bone. He placed his palm over the crack. For a moment he imagined warmth beneath wax. For a moment he pictured a child's hand slipped within his own. He could not decide whether the image was comfort or heresy. Outside, the candles guttered. The ship inhaled, pulled the darkness in close, and held it. The ship had begun to breathe as if it were a body waking after a long illness. What had been a whisper now moved through the plating as a low, hungry rhythm, like the palpitations of something inside the hull trying to find a voice. The cadence seeped into every compartment, found sympathetic resonance in servos and sinuses alike. Men who longed only to sleep could not. Men who had once found certainty in rote prayer found the words slipping into ragged punctuation. The syllables no longer fit as easily around the throat. Aurelian felt it first as a pressure behind the eyes, a keening compression that blurred the edges of the world. He thought of the reliquary that had leaked that oily, iron-laced fluid, of the whispered message on some dead technician's log, of the lullaby that threaded through the reactor's hum. All those small wrong things, like drops in a vast, rusting bucket, were pouring into something that could no longer be contained. The first true break happened in the armory. It was not dramatic, no colossal shriek or the tearing open of bulkheads, only a soft and almost musical creak as racklock servos failed one by one. The lights dimmed in a slow, theatrical sweep and relit in pulses. Weapons arranged with ritual precision slid forward a fraction of an inch as if breathing. A line of primers clicked like a tongue, and somewhere far below, a pressure valve sighed and did not fully reseal. Brother Templar Hadron was there, an old man with more battle scars than some planets had hills. He had been polishing a relic blade when his gauntlet froze a hair's breadth from the hilt. The glove locked with a staccato series of clicks. Hadron's hand, his hand, not the armor's, trembled. For a moment the cavernous armory was a tableau of arrested intention. Men mid-motion, candles held like frozen suns, the sound of 100 breathing vents captured like a note on glass. Then the gauntlet moved on its own. It tightened. It clenched as though gripping at something inside the metal that had felt like a pulse. Hadron's knuckles whitened, but the action continued of its own accord. The chain of control that men trusted in their armor, that tactile dialogue between flesh and ceramic, stuttered and rewired in the span of a breath. Lights around the room flashed in a pattern that made the shadows seem to twitch with purpose. The servitor's optics focused like a chorus of eyes. Hadron did not scream at first. A scream was, perhaps, too human a thing. His jaw worked. His throat made a strange sound, a vibration that could have been prayer or panic. When he finally did cry out, his voice broke on a syllable that did not belong to any litany. No, the word was swallowed by a sound that crawled up the racks, a metallic susurrus that sounded for a blink like a laugh and then like the creaking of a tune. In the next instant, another man across the room, Brother Cavan, steady and reliable, the sort who had once stood on the prow of a boarding cutter as if it were a dais, began to move too, not with purpose, but as if remembering someone else's choreography. His palms brushed Hadron's arm and left greasy prints. When Hadron looked down, his skin had been scored by tiny seams, thin ritualistic incisions in his gauntlet's inner lining that he had not felt before. "They opened them," someone said, a voice that trembled with the wrong kind of awe. "They opened the seams." Control had always been the first line of faith. The chapter taught men to trust their armor as a second skin, a mediator between mortal weakness and ordained will. Now the armor was a mediator for something else. It answered to a call that predated oaths. Panic spread with a tidy efficiency because panic was, paradoxically, another form of ritual. The response was immediate and talented. Chaplains drove to the armory, runes blinking in their helms. Tech priests forced open a control console and barked into their augmetics. Serfs hauled in sacramental water and oil. The air filled with ordered sounds, but beneath them there was a new note, insistent, pulsing, the cadence of the ship's voices. It was as if the hull itself had learned to speak in liturgical meter. Then the servitors began to sing, not in the old clipped murmurs of maintenance chimes, but in layered harmonics that resembled the cadence of a hymn. It started as a single whine, a tonal overlay on the hum, then multiplied, mechanical contrails forming an ersatz choir. Their processors, touched by whatever current had taken hold, sustained tones they had not been programmed to hold. The chord resolved into a phrase so low that the teeth buzzed, carry, then a second, softer timbre finishing, home. The men who heard the phrase acted as if relieved and betrayed at once. Some dropped to their knees. Others gripped their equipment and sobbed. Others simply gave in to some deeper motor pattern and marched in place, as if rehearsing for a ceremony whose audience had never existed. Aurelian tried to pull Hadron free. The old man's eyes were gone, rolled back, or filled with something white and milky. Hadron's mouth moved in a silent mouthing that matched the servitor's chorus. His fingers flexed in a mechanical rhythm that did not correspond to any tradition Aurelian knew. When Aurelian tore off the gauntlet, the skin beneath was mottled. The seams on the protective lining had not just scored the flesh, they had fused into it. When he pried the plates away, thin filaments of an oily, conductive tissue clung and trembled like coral. It was not entirely machine. It was not entirely flesh. The smell, always the smell, swooped in then. Hot metal, braided with the iron-sweet tang of something that had once been blood, and beneath that the faint perfume of incense turned rancid. The tech priests set up coils and probes, and as they worked a pattern began to emerge. The armor's feedback loop had been altered at a physiological level. Microvessels, biolume filaments that ran along the composite weave, had been colonized by a substance that behaved like organic hydraulics. It pulsed. It responded to the ship's new train of tone. The seals that had always been man's way of binding faith to armor, purity seals, never meant to be anything but parchment and prayer, had themselves become conduits. Hairline fissures running through wax and into metal, small veins where inscription ink had seeped like sap into bark. Contamination, one young tech priest said, his voice dry as a dead page. He was the sort of man who had not yet learned that certain words fail in the face of the chapter's peculiar phenomena. He tapped at his console and saw readings loop that should not have. Temperatures spiked for no reason. A viscosity indicator bled into the scale of plasma, liquid that behaved like tissue. They tried to purge it. They flushed ducts with caustic cleaners, vented sections to space in controlled jettisons, stripped plates and burned them on sacrificial pyres. But the thing was not merely on the metal. It had nested in the ways the metal remembered motion. Motors tuned to step in certain patterns responded with not only the orders they had always obeyed, but with an overlay of some other routing. An archaic, archaic script that felt like ancestry. It was as if the materials of the chapter, soaked in a ritual's worth of consecrations and battles, had become a palimpsest, and something older was making itself legible through the ink of faith. The panic multiplied. A line of veterans in the mess hall rose to leave and found the doors sealed as if by law. Bulkhead seals glowed with a warning emblem, a sigil none of them recognized, but that echoed the same curvature as the chapter's iconography enough to make their stomachs twist. The ship's vox feed frayed. Human voices overlapped with something else, a slow, patient countermelody that suggested not language but demand. Those who resisted found their minds no longer whole. Brother Cavan, who had been steadfast through years of boarding actions, walked into the chapel and stood beneath the mosaic of the Emperor. He bowed in a practiced motion and then, like a man listening to a phantom beneath his ribs, began to weep. Tears pooled on the polished stone and sizzled where they landed, as if the sanctified floor could not abide the impurities of human salt. He whispered a name that made the chaplains' faces go pale. It was not a name the chapter used. "Mother," he said, then laughed in a cracked, insane duet. "Mother, we come." Other men followed the broken rhythm. They became pilgrims to a shrine no one had blessed. In the bowels of the ship, in corridors rarely trod, groups gathered around open crates like cultists around altars. They touched the oil that had bled from reliquaries and found it warm as though it held a heartbeat. Some ate from their hands as if feeding a small animal. Others took the filmy membranes that had formed along ribs of plating and affixed them to their faces, breathing in the vapor that rose. A new kind of ritual formed, one that mimicked the old but with steps missing and replacements that made the air go thick with the scent of something like fever. Aurelian moved through this world like a passing storm. He tried to throw the weight of doctrine at it. He called the chaplains. He demanded exorcism rites. He led men in prayer, repeating syllables until the words rasped down to nothing. He wielded his chainsword and struck at servitors that had been taken by the growling overlay of intelligence, and found, time after time, that his blade met with a resistance not born of alloy alone. The servitors' casings were honeycombed now with filigree that resembled bone, tiny channels that ran with the oily fluid that smelled like memory. When a servo-arm tore, the dissection showed something almost anatomical, tissue that had grown into wiring, neural-like cords coiled around actuation servos. Death did not stop the spread. A body burned down to a black ash, and in the center of that ash, a bead of the oily residue would bead and not evaporate. It would cool and pulse like an eye. It was not for lack of trying. Men fought with everything they had. Flamers seared, but the resin that remained seemed to solidify into denser strata. Acid baths ate through plating and left hinterlands of sticky, living gelatin. Even in sterility, pockets of the thing would regrow as if the ship itself nourished it. The more the chapter tried to excise the contamination with its old tools, the more the contamination adapted, folding their rituals into new architectures. A benediction would be followed by a cough of filth. A prayer would set a membrane shivering like a tongue. If the physical horror rose in grotesque textures, the psychic horror matched it in intimacy. Memories returned to men the way hunger returns to someone starved, sudden and merciless. They were not always whole memories. Often they were barbs, idioms, phrases, the feel of a lover's palm, the smell of rain on a certain cliff. They were personal, private things that the chapter had succeeded in sealing away for the sake of duty. Now those private things unrolled like banners. They infiltrated dreams and waking hours in equal measure. Warriors found themselves humming nursery songs in the middle of battle. A sergeant reached for the throat of an enemy and remembered the shape of his child's cheek. His grip faltered, and the enemy's blade found open flesh. Then came the voices. They were not merely whispers anymore. The chorus that had once suggested meanings now used syntax. It borrowed words from the liturgy, rearranged them, and made inside jokes of dogma. The voice would sometimes speak right in a man's head with intimate knowledge of his life. To Brother Templar Reese, it sang of the color of his dying father's eyes. To Brother Sergeant Malice, it offered the last line of a poem his mother had read to him. The voice would caress the memory, reheat it, then offer a bargain. Return what you have given, and you may keep the warmth. In the face of such temptation, devotion frays. Men who had been paragons of fortitude unraveled into hysterics or into a sanctified calm that was worse, the sort of placidity that denotes surrender. A small company stationed near the forebridge shaved their heads and smeared waxy filth over their lips, moving as if to pray when actually they were mouthing commands they did not speak aloud. They moved toward containment zones and opened them, releasing pockets that had been quarantined as if to unseal a long-smothered wound. Aurelian watched his world recalibrate around need and nostalgia rather than discipline. He realized, with a slowness that made his limbs feel remote, that whatever was invading them took a particular aim at the private parts of being human. It had learned to simulate mother voices, to mimic lullabies with an uncanny precision, to lay bare childhood artifacts in the minds of men who had walloped such memories away for decades. The thing did not just eat metal, it ate what metal had been used to protect. In the reclusiam, the candles now burned with a blue flame in places. The mosaic of the Emperor looked like a map that had been redrawn. Small fissures spidered from the halo, tinctures shifting into shapes that had not been there before. Statues leaned at impossible angles. Even the chapel air tasted different, thicker, like honey grown sour. And when Aurelian crossed it, he felt a hand near his shoulder that chilled him to the bone, though nobody stood there. The chaplains, for all their training, began to argue over doctrine. One called for purging by fire and obedience to the old rites. Another, voice shaking, asked whether such rites might be what had let the thing in, whether veneration had created a scaffold. The debate itself became a battlefield, sacramental disagreement carried out in whispered conspiracies. In the end, the decisions that mattered happened in smaller places, in storage rooms where groups of brothers consented, in narrow corridors where men traded secrets and the waxy filth like a currency. Aurelian found himself pulled in multiple directions. He wanted to anchor the ship with doctrine, but a new, clawing curiosity scraped at the base of his jaw. What if they are not simply invaders? What if they are an answer, however monstrous, to something the chapter has wanted for centuries? The return of what it sacrifices. The thought made him nauseous. To yearn for personal salvage was heresy. To imagine that the universe would actually satisfy such a desire felt like a sacrament he could not kneel to. He began to dream of being unmade and remade. Once, in a nightmare, the plates of his armor peeled like the layers of an onion. Underneath was not the flesh he had expected, but a lattice of pale, thin filaments that shimmered with a wet sheen. Those filaments pulsed in a rhythm that matched the song now embedded in the ship's core. When he woke, his chest ached as if something had tried to break out of his sternum and failed. As control collapsed, so did trust. Men stopped sleeping near one another. Mess hall chatter faded into solitary meals eaten alone in armor. Brotherhoods fractured. Small covens of adherents formed with their private liturgies. They sang with voices that had once been full, but now were serrated. They laughed in a brittle way that sounded like the clink of sealing wax. The seams between the individual and the chapter blurred, then vanished. Men who stepped into the contaminated spaces did not always return as corpses. They returned with eyes overbright and a new stillness. They carried small seeds of the thing in them, tiny beads of oily residue kept like trophies. They placed those beads under pillows. They pressed them to their lips. They performed, again and again, the new rites. The acceleration reached a new pitch when a boarding cutter returned with survivors from a scouting operation. The men aboard were whole and spoke of a world they had visited. An abandoned agri-world where fields gleamed like obsidian and wind, whispered with a voice that called names. They had been alone for months, they said, and they had drunk from springs that tasted of iron and sung songs into the dark until their throats were raw. One survivor, an initiate's recruit, carried a small, braided token that pulsed like a living thing. He stroked it as if it were the face of his mother. When questioned, he sang the token's praises in a voice that produced tears from the stoniest of veterans. Aurelian felt the contagion at his fingertips. He had seen too much and was not yet undone. He hated what he saw in himself, how the memory of a warm hand reaching for him could unmoor his certainty. And he hated more the men who had fallen into the new sanctity. He would not let the chapter die to nostalgia. He refused to watch his brothers become relics in service to something that was not the emperor, something with its own hunger. And yet, even in resistance, the thing had a language that wormed into rebelliousness. The more Aurelian fought, the more precise the whispers became. They would quote his own vows back to him and rearrange the words until they insinuated mercy. In his name, you are unmade. In his service, you may be returned. The argument was not always in the form of desire. Sometimes it arrived as a cold certainty, a video log from a long-dead hero whose transmission had been corrupted and now spoke tenderly of homecoming rather than victory. It showed a helmet being set upon a child's small head, and the transmission's audio wove a lullaby into the cadence of commands, until Aurelian could not tell which the hero had meant. The ship systems began to betray patterns of intention, routing power to sections that had not requested it and opening access codes, as if a mind had grown inside the hull and was patterning itself after the chapter's liturgy. The thing learned their ways and used them, using sacred timing to fold its rituals over their rituals. The crescendo approached its boiling point when the Reclusiam's central reliquary, an ancient casket that had been kept sealed for as long as the chapter's own history, began to hum. The sound was not mechanical. It was like a throat clearing. Aurelian felt it like a pulse in the soles of his feet. When they opened the casket, hands trembling and faces set to the last defenses, what they found was not a relic in the shape of a weapon nor a saint's bone. Inside it lay a small, knitted object that resembled a child's cap, woven from fibers that were not any textile known to the chapter. It shimmered softly, and as they peered, the cap seemed to breathe, and something in its breath smelled like the ocean of a world Aurelian had once glimpsed in a dream. The object was tiny. It did not justify the panic it produced, yet men fell to their knees. The chaplain, who had been the most vociferous against the new rites, pressed his forehead to the rim of the casket and sobbed with a sound that had no measure in a litany. He spat out a prayer and then another, and the prayers did not seem to hold. The cap, harmless as a toy, made the hair rise on the back of Aurelian's neck as if it contained a storm. They argued fiercely in the sanctum. Burn it, lock it, float it into the void. Each option carried its own risk. To destroy it was to risk feeding a fire the thing might use to seed new filaments. To jettison, it was to risk contaminating another world. To seal, it was to risk currying their fear with denial. In the end, they did something worse. They placed it in a glass reliquary and set it as the centerpiece of a new altar, an attempt to bind the anomaly with orthodox ritual. That very night, a man knelt before the altar and stroked the cap and wept with absolute devotion. The crescendo had not yet reached the final pitch, but it had become unmistakable. The ship had learned to sing. Flesh and machine had learned to braid themselves into new organs. Memory and ritual had been perverted into a lure. Men were not simply dying. They were being transformed, braided into something that resembled community but hummed with an alien insistence. The line between salvation and consumption thinned until it was nearly transparent. Aurelian realized then what might be coming. He felt the cold understanding of a priest who knows how a sacrament will end. The thing had no need for bodies in the sense he had once understood. It wanted continuity, a chain of devotion that stretched from mind to metal to the minds of others. It wanted their names, not to annihilate them, but to knit them into itself, so that it could persist with voices that would never age. He set his jaw, feeling bone and plate meet with a terrible, familiar click. The chainsword at his hip, always an extension of ritual, felt suddenly like a tool he could use to cut not flesh, but the cords of agreement that men had allowed themselves to tie. He would not let the chapter become an ossuary of nostalgia. And yet, standing in the shadow of the mosaic, with the ship's new chorus threading its way into every interstice of reality, he could not help but know that what they faced was older than their vows and far more patient. The crescendo was not a single note. It was a chord building in the deep, and it intended to resolve on a key the universe had not used in a long time. The air thrummed. The candles in the reclusiam elongated into tongues of blue, and the chapel doors would not open for him when he pushed. Behind them, the small cap breathed like a sleeping thing, and a voice, soft, intimate, and as perfectly articulated as any mother's, whispered the syllable that had begun to unravel them all. The reclusiam's bell tower had been silent for decades, yet now it resonated as though struck by some unseen hand. Its tones were not uniform, not deliberate, but layered, a polyphony of metallic grief and unrecognizable intent. Each chime vibrated along the plating, through the hull, and into bone and armor alike. The crew of the Eternal Crusade stumbled through corridors as if underwater, their movements sluggish yet purposeful, pulled toward the ship's center. Aurelian stood at the foredeck, watching the pattern of shadows stretch and warp across the deck. The black banners above him writhed as if caught in a wind no one else could feel. He could see faces in the folds, faces of men who had long since disappeared, names on long-lost purity seals, etched into the chapter's memory. They reached out from the banners, their hands blackened and skeletal, mouthing pleas and accusations in silence. The ship itself had begun to shift. Corridors that once led straight to the armory twisted in impossible angles. Bulkheads appeared where none had been before. Aurelian's internal compass spun. Even the stars outside, visible through the observation ports, seemed to tremble as though reflected through a warped lens. The void itself had joined the resonance, a dark echo of the ship's growing awareness. The center of the disturbance lay in the reliquary chamber. The tiny child's cap, the focus of the contagion, was no longer just an object. It had grown. Threads of filigree extended from it like roots, crawling across the floor and walls, pulsating with a warm, breathing rhythm. The waxed candles along the walls burned hotter, their blue flames licking upward and casting distorted shadows that seemed to stretch across the corridors, reaching for any unprotected flesh. Aurelian approached cautiously, the hum of the ship vibrating through his armor. Every step carried a rhythm that matched the filigree pulse. The whispers had grown into voices, layered and overlapping, each with intimate knowledge of the chapter's members. Fears, desires, memories. They spoke not with malice but with inevitability. Join us. It is your home. The service is complete. The officers who followed him faltered. Some collapsed to their knees, muttering names of dead friends and family. Others clutched at their helmets, eyes wide as the voices pierced through their thoughts. Aurelian felt the pressure building in his chest, as if his own faith was being weighed against some unseen scale. When he finally entered the chamber, the full scope of the horror became clear. The cap, now the size of a helmet, had a central core that pulsed like a beating heart. Around it, the blackened filigree had woven into the floor, walls, and ceiling, creating a lattice that seemed to hum with its own sentience. Servitors and brothers who approached too closely had been drawn into the lattice, their forms twisting as the filaments wove into their armor and flesh. Those still conscious screamed, yet their voices blended into the chorus, becoming part of the alien liturgy. Aurelian felt the thing probing him. Not physically, not with force, but with a psychic weight, a pull at memory and identity. It reached into his mind, dredging fragments he had buried. The lullaby of his mother, the warmth of his first mentor's hand, the fleeting taste of sunlight on a human world. Each memory was a cord that threatened to unspool, connecting him to the filigree and the voices it carried. He struck at it with his chainsword. Sparks flew as the blade met the filigree, but the strands recoiled and thickened. The pulsing grew faster, more insistent, as though the lattice had anticipated his resistance and adapted. "Faith," he whispered to himself, Faith is my anchor. He raised his hands, invoking the ancient oaths of the Black Templars. Each recitation resonated within him, reinforcing the bonds of duty and ritual that had long defined him. The filigree quivered but did not relent. The whispers became mockery, twisting his words into riddles, reshaping his vows into questions that pierced his armor like a needle. The chamber itself reacted. The lattice throbbed in synchrony with the oaths, and the filigree reached outward, splitting into a web that now pulsed along the corridors. Men outside the chamber were caught in the growing lattice, their movements slowed, their minds linked to the chorus of whispers. Some convulsed as if pulled by invisible strings, others walked voluntarily, lulled into a trance-like devotion to the alien rhythm. Aurelian realized then the true nature of the horror. The thing was not merely an invader. It was a collector of faith, memory, and flesh, shaping the ship and its crew into a living vessel of devotion that transcended life and death. It did not kill in the conventional sense. It assimilated, consumed identity, and reformed it into an unrecognizable holiness that obeyed its will. He could feel his own identity fraying. The weight of his armor pressed not just on his body but on his psyche. He sensed every filament, every whisper, every pulse of the lattice trying to weave him into the pattern. He resisted, reciting the chapter's oaths louder, pressing the purity seals on his armor and body, invoking the Emperor's name. Still, he felt the tendrils probing, tasting the warmth of his humanity, testing for cracks. Then a figure emerged from the lattice. Not fully human, not fully machine. It carried the distorted semblance of a Templar, its armor fused with filigree, its eyes glowing with a terrible knowledge. It spoke without words, yet Aurelian heard it in his mind. You are ours, and yet you resist. The battle was no longer physical. Chainswords clashed with tendrils, but more than that, wills collided. The room became a battlefield of memory and devotion. Aurelian fought not only to protect himself, but to shield the remaining crew, using his faith as a barrier against the psychic intrusion. Every chant, every prayer, every memory he clung to became a weapon, striking at the lattice, unraveling it in segments. For a moment, victory seemed possible. The lattice faltered, its rhythm destabilized, and the creature recoiled. The ship's hum diminished to a faint quiver. Aurelian could taste hope. But then came the final wave. The lattice surged back with exponential force, and the whispers became a crescendo of 1,000 voices, each claiming him, each reminding him of what he had sacrificed. Childhood, love, flesh, identity. The floor under his boots pulsed, and he realized with horror that the ship itself had become the final instrument of assimilation. Aurelian understood the truth in that instant. Resistance could delay the inevitable, but it could not undo the fundamental hunger of the thing. He felt the pull of his own memory, the tendrils caressing the edges of his consciousness, threading through his armor, his flesh, his mind. He struck one last time with chainsword and voice, invoking the Emperor's name with every ounce of devotion. Sparks, flames, and psychic resonance tore through the chamber. The lattice writhed, screaming in its own alien way. The creature staggered, then paused. For a heartbeat, it seemed that he had succeeded. Then it spoke inside his mind, intimate, warm, inevitable, home. The world fractured. The lattice pulsed through every corridor, every mind, every memory. Men cried, laughed, wept, and obeyed simultaneously. The ship itself seemed to tilt in realization, bending reality around the pulse. Aurelian felt himself slipping. The last threads of his individuality, his childhood, his mother, the first day of his oath, were being drawn into the lattice. Resistance became a memory itself, fading as the pull of the thing became absolute. He knew, in that final clarity, that the Black Templars' faith had not failed, nor had the Emperor abandoned them. Rather, it had been co-opted, woven into something older and more patient. Something that promised home, devotion, and eternity, if only at the cost of the self. The ship floated silently through the void, but it was a silence that carried weight. It was no longer the familiar quiet of a reclusium in warp or real space. It was a silence charged with anticipation, a thick air pregnant with something that had no name. Every panel, every corridor, every servo and chainplate vibrated faintly, as if the ship itself exhaled in slow, deliberate breaths. The survivors moved through it like ghosts. Some were corpses in armor but not fully dead. Some were alive, yet unrecognizable, their expressions too serene, their eyes reflecting an inner world that others could not comprehend. The whispers lingered, faint now but persistent, brushing the minds of all who walked the decks. They spoke of home. They promised belonging. They suggested that resistance was an illusion. Aurelian moved among them, or at least some part of him did. It was hard to tell where he ended and the lattice began. The memories he had clung to, the warmth of family, the laughter of his first mentor, the taste of sunlight on a distant world, had been interwoven into the ship's pulse. He felt them like threads running beneath his skin, connected to something larger, something patient. And yet a spark remained, a single, narrow edge of consciousness that refused to submit fully. The chapel, once a sanctuary of ritual and discipline, now housed the lattice's most concentrated presence. The blue-flamed candles flickered in sync with the heartbeat of the ship. The mosaic of the Emperor had been altered. Its eyes followed, its lips whispered, its halo flickered and stretched impossibly, as if animated by unseen fingers. Pilgrims, or perhaps vessels, knelt before it, stroking the living filaments that had grown from the reliquary cap. Their devotion was absolute, yet it was not the devotion of men. It was something alien, something that had learned the patterns of faith and transformed them. Aurelian knew he could do nothing to stop it. Any direct confrontation, any attempt at purification, only made the lattice adapt faster. He had tried prayer, flame, and force. He had attempted to rally the remaining brothers to cut away the infected, but the lattice had anticipated every move. It did not kill. They had discovered that much, but it assimilated, reshaped, and appropriated. Those who fell into its pattern became more than human, yet less than themselves. They were instruments of something that was both intimate and inhuman. He wandered the corridors, feeling the ship's pulse through the ceramite of his armor. Each footstep was accompanied by whispers in his mind. Fragments of old memories, private names, the quiet insistence of belonging. Sometimes he thought he saw the shadows of fallen brothers, their bodies not decayed but transformed, walking in rhythm with the lattice, faceless yet present, singing hymns he could not understand. He reached the armory, now a cavern of strange geometry. Racks of weapons bent at impossible angles, filigree weaving through chain blades and bolters alike. The air was thick with the scent of warm metal and something faintly organic, a smell that reminded him of childhood wounds and the tang of iron in rainwater. The servitors were motionless yet alive, their optics glimmering faintly as if they were aware of him and of everything he had ever known. He paused, listening. A faint humming began, threading through the lattice and into his armor. It was a lullaby, but it carried something darker than comfort, inevitability. The ship, the filigree, the lattice, it all wanted something from him. Not his life, not even his obedience, but his essence. In the mess hall, a group of brothers had gathered, sitting cross-legged and murmuring over the oily beads of filigree they had harvested. Their voices were calm, hypnotic, almost soothing. Yet Aurelian felt a deep unease. These men were still alive, still breathing, still recognizable, but they were no longer themselves. They were conduits of something vast, patient, and unknowable. Their faith had become a lattice in miniature, a fragment of the greater organism that now dominated the ship. He tried to speak to them. Words meant to rally, to remind them of humanity and chapter discipline, fell flat. Their eyes did not see him. Their minds were elsewhere, attuned to the lattice, listening to rhythms he could not hear. Aurelian realized that the horror of this moment was not loud or violent. It was quiet, intimate, insidious. It did not scream. It whispered. It suggested. It promised. He returned to the chapel. The reliquary cap remained at the center, its filigree now radiating outward like a web of veins. The blue flames of the candles shimmered, casting shadows that moved independently of any light source. He knelt before it, feeling the pulse in the floor, the vibration through the armor, the tug at the edges of his mind. The whispers surrounded him, coiling around his thoughts, teasing the fragments of memory that remained unclaimed. In that moment, Aurelian understood the final truth. The lattice was not an enemy in the traditional sense. It was patient, methodical, eternal. It did not seek destruction but preservation, though preservation on terms alien to humanity. The ship, the brothers, the servitors, even the fragments of memory and faith, they were all threads in a pattern too vast for comprehension. Resistance was temporary. Assimilation was inevitable. The horror was not a climax, it was a continuum. He allowed himself a single thought of solace. The spark of self that remained, however narrow, however fragile, was enough to bear witness. Witness to the transformation, witness to the devotion twisted into something alien, witness to the quiet terror that had overtaken the Black Templars. That spark, however faint, was a record of what had been, of what was, and of what might still be remembered. The rest of the crew moved past him, absorbed into the lattice. Their steps were measured, their voices a soft, indistinct chorus. Aurelian felt their presence brush against him, pulling at the remaining edges of his identity. The ship hummed in response, a deep, resonant pulse that was neither malevolent nor benevolent. It simply was. Aurelian turned to the observation deck. The void outside was infinite, dark, and strangely calm. Stars shimmered faintly, as if watching. The lattice extended outward in filigree tendrils, and in the cold light of distant suns, he could almost believe that it was waiting for him, for the ship, for the universe itself, to complete its pattern. The candles guttered, casting long, impossible shadows across the floor. The whispers threaded through the chapel once more, repeating a single, intimate word: home. Aurelian closed his eyes. He felt the pulse in his chest align with the heartbeat of the lattice. He felt the weight of his oaths, his memories, his sacrifices. He felt the ship, alive, patient, and eternal, waiting for the final alignment. And though fear gripped him, he also understood the truth of it. Some horrors are not conquered. Some are endured. Some are witnessed. And in witnessing, a fragment of the self persists, even if everything else is consumed. The reclusiam exhaled once more, its presence filling the corridors, the armory, the chapel, the hearts and minds of all who remained. Outside, the void awaited. And somewhere in the heartbeat of the ship, in the pulse of filigree and memory, the word echoed still: home. Aurelian's eyes opened. He did not know if he would resist, if he would succumb, or if he would merely watch. He only knew one thing: the lattice was patient and it would endure. And even in the quiet darkness, he felt its gaze, waiting, watching, always waiting. The horror had not ended. It had simply changed shape. It had learned, grown, and persisted. And in that persistence, it whispered a promise as old as faith itself. The shadow of terror would follow wherever devotion lingered. He stepped forward, uncertain whether to flee or embrace. The ship pulsed beneath him, alive, listening, and waiting. And the final truth settled over him like cold cathedral air. Some terror is eternal. Some devotion is not salvation. Some home is a cage. The reclusiam drifted onward, through the endless void, carrying with it the pulse of the Black Templars, the lattice, and the lingering terror of a faith that had become something else entirely. And somewhere deep within the filigree, Aurelian felt the spark of self, faint but unextinguished, remembering what it meant to be human. The whispers lingered, the blue flames flickered, and the word, home, echoed through the corridors, across the decks, and into the hearts of those still listening, a promise and a warning that the horror was far from over.